Some choices define us more than a lifetime of words ever could. And sometimes the hardest choice is to save the life of a man who destroyed yours. The spring rains came to Ironwood Valley and turned the river wild. Most folks ran for safety. Jonas Creed rode toward the danger. He was a mountain man the town had long forgotten. Then a stagecoach overturned and passengers scattered into the flood. One of them was Charles Whitmore, the railroad tycoon who once had Jonas thrown in jail. As Whitmore screamed for help in the raging water, everyone stood frozen. Everyone but Jonas. He dove in without thinking. What happened next changed everything. Why would a man risk his life for someone who hated him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ironwood Valley sat cradled between two mountain ranges like a secret the earth had kept for itself. The town had grown up around the bend of the Clearwater River, where the water ran cold and clear most of the year, and the cottonwoods grew thick enough to provide shade through the hottest summers. It was the kind of place where a man could know his neighbors by the sound of their footsteps on the boardwalk, where children grew up swimming in the same swimming holes their fathers had, where the rhythm of life moved slow and steady as the seasons themselves. Jonas Creed had lived in the mountains above the valley for the better part of 5 years now. His cabin sat perched on a ridge where he could see the whole valley spread out below him like a patchwork quilt. The farms with their neat fences, the main street with its row of storefronts, the church steeple rising white against the green of the surrounding forest. He'd built the cabin himself, cutting each log and notching them with care, chinked the walls with mud and moss to keep out the winter cold. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that meant something after losing everything else most mornings. Jonas would stand on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks and spill gold across the valley floor. He'd watch the smoke rise from chimneys as families started their cook fires, see the distant figures of men heading to the mill or the mine, watch the stagecoach make its way along the rutted road that connected Ironwood to the wider world beyond the mountains. He was close enough to see it all, far enough that no one had to see him. The isolation suited him fine. He had his traps to check, game to hunt, a small garden that gave him what vegetables he needed. Once a month, maybe twice when supplies ran low, he'd ride down to old Ruth's general store for flour, coffee, salt, and whatever other necessities he couldn't provide for himself. Those trips into town were exercises in endurance. He'd hitch his horse outside Ruth's store, keep his hat pulled low, and move through his business as quickly as possible while folks whispered and stared. Old Ruth was one of the few who treated him like a human being. She'd been running that store since before Jonas was born, had known him as a boy, watched him grow into a man, and hadn't turned her back on him when the rest of the town did. She was somewhere north of 70 now, with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that could see right through a man's pretenses to whatever truth he was hiding. "You look thin." "Jonas," she'd say, packing his supplies with efficient movements. "You eating enough up there?" "Enough to get by, Ruth. Getting by isn't the same as living." She'd give him that look, the one that said she knew exactly how hollow his days were. Mary wouldn't want you wasting away on that mountain. The mention of Mary always hit him like a fist to the chest, but he never showed it. He'd just nod, pay for his goods, and tip his hat. "Give my regards to your grandson. You could give them yourself if you'd come to church on Sunday. I don't think the Lord and I are on speaking terms these days." "Ruth, the Lord's always listening, Jonas. It's us who stop talking." Those conversations were about as close as Jonas got to human connection anymore. Sometimes Sheriff Dalton would nod to him on the street, a quick acknowledgement that held more apology than greeting. Dalton was a decent man caught in an impossible position, and Jonas didn't hold the arrest against him. The sheriff had been following orders, trying to keep the peace, doing what he thought was necessary even if it was wrong. Jonas understood that kind of impossible choice better than most. Then there was Sarah Mackenzie. She taught at the schoolhouse on the edge of town, and every time Jonas saw her, which wasn't often, something in his chest would tighten like a knot being pulled. They'd been engaged once, years ago, before the railroad came, and everything fell apart. Her father was a banker who'd invested heavily in Whitmore's railroad expansion, and when the accusations against Jonas started flying, he'd given Sarah an ultimatum: the engagement or her inheritance. She'd chosen security over love, and Jonas had never blamed her for it. A woman alone in the West had few options and fewer safety nets. Still, sometimes when their eyes met across the street, he could see the regret there, could see that she'd paid her own price for that choice. The town itself had changed in the 5 years since Jonas had retreated to the mountains. The railroad had come through just as Whitmore promised, bringing prosperity to some and ruin to others. New businesses had sprung up along the main street: a hotel for traveling businessmen, a telegraph office, even a small bank. The population had nearly doubled, and not all the new faces were friendly. There were railroad men who swaggered through town like they owned it, which in a way they did. There were speculators who'd bought up land cheap and were waiting for the right moment to sell it dear. There were men who'd come west not to build something, but to take what others had built. Charles Whitmore himself had been in Ironwood Valley for the past 3 weeks, staying at the hotel while he oversaw some new expansion of his railroad empire. Jonas had seen him from a distance, a tall man in an expensive suit, silver-haired and commanding, the kind of man who expected the world to rearrange itself for his convenience. He traveled with an entourage of lawyers and engineers and sycophants, held court in the hotel dining room, and treated the townspeople like subjects in his kingdom. Jonas had stayed away from town during Whitmore's visit, had no desire to lay eyes on the man who'd destroyed his life. In his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden at the bottom, was the tin star he'd worn as deputy. He'd been proud of that badge once, proud to serve and protect, proud to be a man the community trusted. Now it was just a piece of tarnished metal, a reminder of everything he'd lost: his reputation, his future, his wife. Mary had been the best part of him. She'd been a small woman with dark hair and laughing eyes, the daughter of a homesteader who taught her to be tough and tender in equal measure. She could birth a calf, mend a fence, shoot straight enough to bring down a deer, and still make a home feel warm just by being in it. They'd married young, bought a piece of land with every penny they could scrape together, and started building their dream, a ranch where they'd raise cattle and children, where they'd grow old together watching the seasons turn. Then the railroad surveyors came through and decided Jonas's land was exactly where they needed to put a junction. Whitmore made an offer, less than a third of what the land was worth. Jonas refused. A week later, he was arrested for trespassing on railroad property, for stealing company equipment, for threatening workers. None of it was true, but Whitmore had money for lawyers and witnesses who'd swear to anything for the right price. Jonas had his word and nothing else. He'd spent 3 months in jail while Mary struggled to hold on to the ranch alone. By the time Sheriff Dalton finally released him, the charges dropped for lack of evidence. Though the damage was done, Mary had taken ill. Fever, the doctor said, brought on by exhaustion and worry. She died 2 days later, and Jonas had held her hand the whole time, whispering apologies she was too far gone to hear. The ranch was seized for unpaid taxes. Jonas's reputation was ruined. The community that had known him his whole life now looked at him with suspicion and fear. So he'd taken what little he could carry and gone up into the mountains, where at least the silence was honest. Now, 5 years later, he stood on his porch, watching dark clouds gather over the western peaks. The spring rains had been heavy this year, heavier than anyone could remember. The snowpack in the high country was melting fast, and the clear water was running high and mean. Jonas had seen floods before. The valley got them every few years when conditions were right. But something about the weight of these clouds, the thickness of the air, the way the birds had gone quiet, told him this was going to be worse than usual. He should have stayed on his mountain, should have secured his cabin, brought his horse into the lean-to, and waited out whatever was coming. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. But Jonas Creed had never been good at choosing safety over what was right, and somewhere deep in his bones, He felt that the valley was going to need every able-bodied man before this storm was through. So he saddled his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa mare named Dancer, checked his rifle, and started down the mountain trail toward Ironwood Valley. The first drops of rain hit his face as he rode, cold and hard as thrown pebbles. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sky had opened up and the world had turned to water. The rain came down in sheets so thick Jonas could barely see 10 feet ahead. It wasn't the gentle spring rain that coaxed flowers from the ground. This was something biblical, something angry. The drops hit hard enough to sting exposed skin, and the wind drove them sideways, so no amount of shelter offered protection. Lightning cracked across the sky in jagged white scars, and the thunder that followed shook the ground beneath Dancer's hooves. Jonas guided his mare along the main road toward town, but the road was already disappearing under rushing water. What had been wagon ruts this morning were now streams, and the streams were joining together into something larger and more dangerous. He could hear the clear water roaring even over the storm, a sound like freight trains colliding, and he knew without seeing it that the river had already jumped its banks. As he rounded the bend that gave view to the town, Jonas pulled Dancer to a halt. The valley had transformed into something he barely recognized. Water covered the low-lying fields, swallowing fences and turning pastures into lakes. The main street was a river itself, with water flowing fast enough to carry debris, broken lumber, a chicken coop, someone's front door. People were scrambling for higher ground, some wading through waist-deep water with children on their shoulders. Others already safe on the upper floors of buildings, watching helplessly as their lives floated away. Then Jonas heard it, screaming, high-pitched and terrified, coming from the direction of the river crossing. He kicked Dancer into motion, and the mare responded despite her fear, splashing through the flood toward the sound. And the townsfolk were running that way too, Sheriff Dalton among them, but they were moving against the current and making slow progress. Jonas saw the stagecoach before he understood what had happened. It was tilted at a crazy angle near the riverbank, one side buried in mud, the other pointing skyward. The horses that had been pulling it were gone, either drowned or run off, and the driver was clinging to the top of the coach, rain and river water streaming over him. But it was the passengers Jonas focused on, the 3 figures struggling in the water below, 2 of them, a woman in a blue dress and a younger man who might have been her son, were being pulled toward shore by a couple of brave townsmen who'd waded out as far as they dared. But the 3rd passenger had been caught by the full force of the current. The clear water had him, and the clear water wasn't giving him back without a fight. The man flailed in the water, his arms thrashing, his head going under and coming back up as he gasped for air. He was wearing expensive clothes. Jonas could see that even from a distance, a fine suit that was now soaked and heavy, pulling him down. Around his neck was a gold chain, and even in his panic, the man kept one hand pressed to his vest pocket as if protecting something there. Jonas had been in enough fights to know when a man was losing. This man was losing. Another minute, maybe 2, and the river would have him for good. Sheriff Dalton had reached the riverbank, along with a dozen other men. They were shouting, pointing, but no one was moving. Jonas understood why. The clear water was a monster right now, churning with enough force to smash a grown man against the rocks downstream, to drag him under and hold him there until his lungs gave out. Going into that water was suicide. Then the drowning man's head broke the surface one more time, and Jonas saw his face clearly. Even with his hair plastered to his skull, even with terror replacing his usual arrogance, Jonas recognized Charles Whitmore. Time seemed to slow. Jonas sat on his horse, rain hammering down, watching the man who destroyed his life, fighting for that life in the raging water. Every logical part of Jonas's mind said to sit still, to let nature take its course, to let Whitmore pay for his sins the way Mary had paid for being married to a man who stood in the way of progress. It would be easy. He wouldn't even have to do anything, just fail to act, and his enemy would be gone. But Jonas had never been a man who let logic overrule his conscience. Mary wouldn't have wanted this, wouldn't have wanted him to become the kind of man who could watch another human being drown, no matter what that human being had done. And somewhere deeper than thought, in the place where a man's true character lived, Jonas knew he couldn't live with himself if he let Whitmore die. Not because Whitmore deserved saving, but because Jonas deserved to be the kind of man who would try. He swung down from Dancer, handed the reins to the nearest person, and started stripping off his coat and gun belt. Sheriff Dalton grabbed his arm. "Jonas, you can't. That current will kill you." "Maybe," Jonas said. "But I'm going anyway." He didn't give himself time to reconsider. He waded into the water, felt its strength immediately, trying to knock his feet out from under him, and kept going. The cold hit him like a fist, stealing his breath, but he pushed forward until the bottom dropped away and he had to swim. The current grabbed him instantly, pulling him downstream, and for a moment Jonas thought he'd made a fatal mistake. But he'd grown up swimming in this river, knew its moods and its tricks, and he angled his body to use the current rather than fight it. He let it carry him toward where Whitmore was struggling, timing his strokes, conserving his strength. Whitmore went under again, and this time he didn't come back up as quickly. Jonas put everything he had into closing the distance, his arms burning, his lungs screaming for air. He dove under, eyes open despite the murk, and saw Whitmore sinking, his movements growing slower, weaker. Jonas caught him by the collar and kicked hard for the surface. They broke through together, Whitmore coughing and gasping, too exhausted to do more than clutch at Jonas's shirt. The current had them both now, dragging them downstream faster than Jonas could swim against. He looked around frantically, searching for anything they could use, and saw it, a partially collapsed barn on higher ground. Its roof caved in, but some walls still standing. He aimed for it, swimming at an angle across the current, pulling Whitmore with him. His muscles were on fire, his vision starting to blur at the edges. But he kept going, because stopping meant dying, and he'd be damned if he'd saved Whitmore just to drown alongside him. His hand hit wood, and Jonas grabbed on with everything he had. The current tried to rip them away, but Jonas held on, pulled them both around to the lee side of the barn, where the water was slightly calmer, and found a gap in the collapsed wall. He shoved Whitmore through first, then dragged himself after, both of them collapsing on the mud floor inside. For a long time, neither man could do anything but breathe. Jonas lay on his back, chest heaving, every muscle in his body trembling. Beside him, Whitmore was curled on his side, coughing up river water, his face grey with exhaustion and cold. The barn offered minimal shelter. Rain came through gaps in the roof, and water flowed across the floor, but it was solid ground and out of the main current. Jonas forced himself to sit up to assess their situation. They were trapped here until the water receded, which might not be until morning. No fire, no dry clothes, and night coming on fast. Whitmore had stopped coughing and was breathing more steadily now. His hand still clutched his vest pocket, and through the wet fabric, Jonas could see the outline of a pocket watch. Gold, expensive, probably worth more than Jonas's entire cabin. The man had nearly drowned protecting a timepiece. "Thank you," Whitmore gasped, his voice hoarse. He still hadn't looked at Jonas, hadn't seen who'd saved him. "I thought I was finished." "Thank you." Jonas didn't respond. He was trying to remember why he'd done this, trying to hold on to the feeling that had driven him into the water. Because right now, sitting in this ruined barn with the man who'd destroyed everything he loved, all Jonas felt was tired. Whitmore finally turned his head, squinting through the dim light at his rescuer. Jonas watched recognition dawn in those eyes, watched it turn from gratitude to confusion, to something like fear. "You," Whitmore whispered. "You're Creed." "I am. The trespasser. The thief." Jonas felt something cold settle in his chest, colder than the river water, still dripping from his clothes. "I was neither," he said quietly. "I was the man whose land you wanted, the man whose wife died while he was in jail on your false charges, the man whose life you destroyed because he wouldn't step aside for your railroad." Whitmore's face had gone even paler. "You saved me." "Why would you save me?" Jonas thought about that for a moment, watching the rain hammer down outside their shelter. "Because my wife would have wanted me to," he said finally. "Because becoming the kind of man who lets another man drown, even a man like you, means you've already taken more from me than my land and my reputation. It means you've taken who I am." He stood up, moved to the far corner of the barn, and wrapped his arms around himself against the cold. "We're stuck here until the water goes down. Probably morning. I suggest we don't talk more than necessary." Whitmore didn't respond. He just stared at Jonas with an expression that might have been guilt, or might have been shock, or might have been something else entirely. Then he pulled out his pocket watch, water streaming from it, and tried unsuccessfully to make it work. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside the barn, two men who should have been enemies sat in silence, bound together by a choice that neither of them fully understood yet. And somewhere in that silence, something began to shift, something that would change both their lives in ways the flood had only hinted at. The night crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jonas found some old burlap sacks in a corner of the barn that were only partially soaked, and he used them to create a makeshift bedding area away from the worst of the water seepage. His clothes were drenched, and the temperature was dropping as night settled in. He could feel his body starting to shake with cold, but there was nothing to be done about it. No dry wood for a fire, no shelter from the wind that whistled through the gaps in the barn walls. Whitmore had pulled himself into a sitting position against the far wall, still clutching that pocket watch like it was a lifeline. In the dim light that filtered through the storm clouds, Jonas could see him shivering violently, his lips taking on a bluish tinge. Pride or shock kept the man silent, but Jonas could read the signs of hypothermia setting in. They both needed warmth, and they needed it soon. "Take off your jacket," Jonas said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain. Whitmore looked at him with confusion. "What?" "Your jacket and vest. They're soaked and they're pulling heat from your body faster than you can make it. Take them off. I'll freeze. You'll freeze faster if you keep them on. Trust me or don't, but I've spent enough winters in these mountains to know what cold can do to a man." Whitmore hesitated, then slowly began working the buttons of his vest with trembling fingers. Jonas did the same with his own shirt, wringing as much water from it as he could before spreading it across one of the burlap sacks. When Whitmore had removed his jacket and vest, Jonas took them and did the same, laying them out where they might catch whatever air circulation existed in the barn, from his saddlebag, which he'd somehow managed to keep with him through the rescue. Jonas pulled out a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was jerky, hardtack, and a piece of cornbread that old Ruth had pressed on him during his last visit to town. The oilcloth had kept most of it dry. He broke the cornbread in half and held one piece out to Whitmore. "Eat. Your body needs fuel to stay warm." Whitmore took the cornbread with a mumbled thanks and bit into it. They ate in silence, the simple act of chewing and swallowing requiring more effort than it should have. When the food was gone, Jonas pulled the least wet burlap sack around his shoulders like a shawl and settled back against the wall. "We should share body heat," Jonas said matter-of-factly. "Survival isn't about pride. It's about making it to morning. I'm fine where I am. Suit yourself." Another hour passed. The shaking got worse for both of them. Finally, Whitmore's pride broke, and he moved closer to Jonas, not quite touching, but near enough that their combined body heat created a small pocket of warmth between them. Neither man spoke, but the simple act of accepting help seemed to cost Whitmore something. As the night wore on and exhaustion began to override discomfort, Whitmore finally broke the silence. "I don't understand," he said quietly. "Why did you do it? Why save me?" Jonas didn't answer right away. He was watching the rain through a gap in the wall, thinking about Mary, about the ranch they'd built, about the life that had been stolen from them. "You have children, Whitmore?" The question seemed to surprise him. "No, I was married once, but there were no children. Mary and I wanted children, planned for a whole house full of them. She used to carve these little wooden toys, horses and dolls, and put them in a trunk for the babies we'd have someday." Jonas paused, his throat tight. "After she died, I found that trunk, opened it up and saw all those toys she'd made, all those dreams she'd had. He pulled something from his saddlebag, a small wooden horse, beautifully carved despite its rough materials, smooth from being handled. Started making them myself after that. Don't really know why. Maybe to feel close to her. Maybe to keep that dream alive somehow, even though it'll never come true. Whitmore looked at the horse, then at Jonas. That's why you saved me? Because of wooden horses. I saved you because watching a man die when I could stop it would have meant letting you take something else from me. Something more important than land or reputation. Jonas turned the horse over in his hands. It would have meant letting you take the man Mary loved. The man she believed I was. And I'll be damned if I give you that too. Whitmore was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller somehow, less certain. The watch, he said, pulling the ruined timepiece from his pocket. It was my grandfather's. He was a clockmaker in Boston. Gave me this when I went west to make my fortune. Told me to remember that every moment counts, that time spent well is the only real wealth. He tried to wind it, but water had destroyed the mechanism. I spent my whole life chasing time, trying to build something that would last, trying to make a mark that wouldn't fade. Built an empire out of steel and steam, and the labor of thousands of men. And somewhere along the way, I forgot what my grandfather meant. Started thinking time was money, that every moment had to produce something tangible. Why are you telling me this? Jonas asked. Because you risked your life for mine, and I don't know what to do with that. Whitmore's hands were shaking, and not just from cold. I've spent years believing that progress requires sacrifice, that some men have to fall so that civilization can rise. Told myself that what happened to you was regrettable but necessary. Just the cost of moving forward. And now I'm alive because the man I destroyed decided I was worth saving. And I don't know if that makes you a fool or a saint or something else entirely. Jonas let out a breath that might have been a laugh. I'm none of those things. I'm just a man trying to live with himself. That's all any of us can do. Dawn came slowly, the storm finally breaking as grey light filtered through the clouds. The rain had stopped, though water still rushed past the barn in streams and rivulets. Jonas stood and looked out through the gaps in the wall. The valley was a disaster, buildings damaged, fields underwater, debris scattered everywhere. But the worst had passed. In the distance he could hear voices calling out, search parties looking for survivors. Jonas cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted, his voice carrying across the water. Within minutes, he could see figures approaching. Sheriff Dalton, at the head of a group of men with a makeshift raft. Whitmore got to his feet, still unsteady, and stood beside Jonas. I need to make things right, he said. I don't know how, but I need to try. Jonas looked at him, this man who'd taken everything, and saw something he hadn't expected, genuine remorse. Whether it would last beyond the fear and exhaustion of the moment, he didn't know. But it was a start. Then make them right, Jonas said. But understand this. No amount of money can bring back what I lost. My wife is still dead. Those 5 years are still gone. Some things can't be bought or sold or negotiated. I know, Whitmore said quietly. Believe me, I know. The rescue party reached them, and Sheriff Dalton pulled them both onto the raft. Townspeople crowded around, checking on Whitmore, asking if he was hurt. A few glanced at Jonas with something like grudging respect, but most still kept their distance. He was the man who'd saved the railroad tycoon, but he was still Jonas Creed, the accused trespasser, the mountain man who lived alone. Only old Ruth pushed through the crowd and wrapped Jonas in a fierce hug, heedless of his wet clothes. You damn fool, she whispered. Risking your life for the likes of him. I didn't do it for him, Ruth. I did it for me. She pulled back and looked at him with those sharp eyes that saw too much. Mary would be proud of you, boy. Jonas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As the raft carried them back toward town, he looked at Whitmore, who was being fussed over by his associates and doctors. Their eyes met briefly, and something unspoken passed between them. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The storm had forced them together, and in that crucible, something had begun to change. What that change would mean, neither man could say yet. But as they reached dry land and went their separate ways, both carried with them the weight of the night they'd shared. Two men who'd been enemies. bound together by water and survival, and the complicated truth that people were rarely as simple as the roles they played. The town doctor insisted on examining both men, though his attention focused primarily on Whitmore. Jonas accepted a blanket and a cup of hot coffee, then quietly slipped away while the crowd was distracted. He had no desire to be fawned over or questioned about his heroism. What he'd done for his own reasons, and they were nobody's business but his own. He found Dancer tied where he'd left her, the mare wet and tired but unharmed. Jonas checked her over carefully, then led her to the livery stable, where the owner, a gruff man named Peterson, took one look at them both and shook his head. "Heard what you did, Creed. Crazy thing. Going into that water. Had to be done. Most men wouldn't have, especially not for Whitmore." Peterson began rubbing down the mare with practiced efficiency. "She'll be fine. Tough animal. I'll grain her and keep her here until the road's dry enough for you to head home." Jonas nodded his thanks and headed back out into the aftermath of the flood. The main street was littered with debris, furniture, clothing, tools, whole sections of fence. People were beginning the grim work of assessing the damage, pulling waterlogged belongings from their homes, trying to salvage what they could. Children helped their parents, their faces solemn with the weight of disaster. An old woman sat on her porch steps, weeping quietly as she held a ruined photograph album. Jonas walked through it all with his hands in his pockets, feeling the familiar isolation settle back over him like a coat. He'd saved Whitmore's life, but nothing had really changed. These people still saw him as the outsider, the accused criminal, the man who'd been cast out. One act of bravery wouldn't erase 5 years of suspicion and judgment. As he passed the general store, old Ruth called out to him, "Jonas Creed, don't you dare walk by without coming in here." He turned to find her standing in the doorway, hands on her hips, looking fierce despite the exhaustion evident in every line of her face. Her store had taken on water, and she'd spent the morning hauling damaged goods outside. "Come on," she said, waving him in. "I've got stew on the stove, and you look half dead." The inside of the store smelled like wet wood, and the herbs Ruth kept hanging from the rafters. Jonas sat at the small table she kept in the back room, while she ladled out generous portions of venison stew into 2 bowls. They ate in comfortable silence for a while, the warmth of the food spreading through Jonas's chest. "Found something this morning," Ruth said after a while. She stood and retrieved a small object from a shelf, placing it on the table between them. It was a child's wooden horse, beautifully carved, but weathered by time and water. "Was floating in the debris outside my door." Jonas picked it up, turning it over in his hands. The craftsmanship was excellent, better than his own attempts. The wood had darkened with age and water damage, but the form was still clear, a horse in mid-gallop, mane flowing. "Powerful and free. That's fine work," he said quietly. "Made it 30 years ago," Ruth said. "For my grandson. He's grown now, has children of his own back east, but I kept that horse all these years. Meant something to me." She paused. "Seems fitting somehow that it found its way to you." Jonas looked up at her, saw the meaning in her eyes. She knew about the toys he carved, about the trunk Mary had left behind. She was telling him something without saying it directly. "You can't keep living on that mountain forever, Jonas," she said gently. "Mary wouldn't have wanted that for you." "Mary's gone." "Yes, she is. And that's a grief you'll carry the rest of your days. But you're not gone. You're still here, still breathing, still able to do good in this world." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "What you did today took courage. Not just the jumping in the river part, though Lord knows that was brave enough. But saving the man who destroyed you, that took a different kind of courage. The kind that comes from the heart." Jonas didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He finished his stew, thanked Ruth for the meal and the horse, and stepped back out into the damaged town. The wooden horse went into his pocket next to the one he'd carved himself. 2 horses, 2 different hands, but both speaking to the same truth, that something worthwhile could be created even in the face of loss. He made his way to the edge of town where the temporary schoolhouse stood. Sarah Mackenzie was there with a group of children, all of them helping to clear debris from the schoolyard. She looked up as he approached, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then she set down the branch she'd been carrying and walked over to him. "Jonas," she said, and just his name in her voice carried years of history. "Miss Mackenzie, I heard what you did. That was—" She stopped, searching for words. "I don't know if it was brave or foolish, but it was remarkable. Just did what needed doing." "No," she said firmly. "You did more than that. You could have let him drown. No one would have blamed you. Half the town would have called it justice." She looked at him with those eyes that had once promised him a future. "But you didn't. You risked everything to save him. That says something about who you are." Jonas looked past her at the children working in the yard, at their resilience in the face of disaster. "Who I am doesn't matter much to most folks around here. It matters to me." The words came out softly, almost too soft to hear over the sounds of the town recovering around them. "It always has." Before Jonas could respond, one of the children called out, pointing excitedly. They'd found something in the debris, a collection of books from the schoolhouse, wet but salvageable if they were dried carefully. Sarah gave Jonas one last look, something unspoken passing between them, then hurried back to help the children. Jonas stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the wooden horse in his pocket, feeling the exhaustion of the last 24 hours finally catching up with him. He needed to get back to his cabin, to his solitude, to the life he'd built in the absence of everything else. But as he walked back toward the livery stable, he found himself thinking about Sarah's words, about old Ruth's gift, about the way Whitmore had looked at him in the barn when he'd spoken about his grandfather's watch. Something had shifted during that long night. Some crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around himself, and he didn't know if he had the strength to patch it or the courage to let it widen. 3 days passed before Jonas saw Whitmore again. He'd spent those days helping with the cleanup, working alongside townspeople who were gradually becoming less suspicious and more grateful. He repaired roofs, cleared debris, and helped rebuild a family's chicken coop that had been swept away. The work felt good, purposeful in a way his solitary life on the mountain never quite managed to be. On the 3rd evening, Sheriff Dalton found him at old Ruth's store, where Jonas had been helping move water-damaged merchandise. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, his hat turning over and over in his hands. "Jonas, need to talk to you," Dalton said. "Whitmore's called a town meeting. Tonight at the hotel. He specifically asked that you attend." Jonas felt his jaw tighten. "I've got no interest in whatever Whitmore has to say. Please, just come listen. For me, if for no one else." Something in Dalton's voice made Jonas agree. An hour later, he found himself standing at the back of the hotel's dining room, which had been cleared of tables to accommodate the crowd. Seemed like half the town had turned out, curious about what the railroad magnate had to say. Whitmore stood at the front of the room, looking thinner than Jonas remembered, his expensive suit exchanged for simpler clothes. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man used to being obeyed, but something in his manner had softened. "I've called you all here to discuss the rebuilding effort," Whitmore began. "The flood caused significant damage to this community, and I intend to fund the reconstruction. New buildings where needed, repairs to existing structures, compensation for lost livestock and crops." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was the Whitmore they expected, generous but controlling, helping but always with strings attached. "However," Whitmore continued, and something in his tone made everyone go quiet, "I want to address something more important, something personal." He paused, and Jonas saw him reach into his pocket, pulling out a small object. Even from the back of the room, Jonas could see it was a compass, silver, beautifully made, glinting in the lamplight. "This compass belonged to my grandfather," Whitmore said. "He was a clockmaker in Boston, a humble man who made a simple living with his hands. When I came west, he gave me this and told me to let it guide me true. I forgot that guidance somewhere along the way, forgot what true north really meant." He looked directly at Jonas then, and the room seemed to follow his gaze. Jonas felt every eye turned toward him, but he kept his face neutral, refusing to show emotion. "3 nights ago, a man saved my life," Whitmore said. "A man I'd wronged terribly. I had Jonas Creed arrested on false charges because his land stood in the way of my railroad expansion. I paid witnesses to lie. I used my power and influence to destroy his reputation, to take everything he'd built. His wife died while he was in jail, died because of my actions. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Old Ruth put a hand to her mouth. Sarah Mackenzie turned to look at Jonas, her eyes wide. Even those who'd suspected the truth seemed stunned to hear Whitmore admit it so boldly. I can't undo what I did. Whitmore continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion Jonas could hear beneath it. I can't bring back Jonas's wife. I can't return the 5 years he spent in isolation, cast out by a community that should have stood by him. But I can tell the truth, and I can try to make amends. He produced a sheaf of papers from inside his jacket. These are the original documents related to Jonas Creed's case. The forged testimonies, the falsified records, the legal manipulations my lawyers used. I'm turning them over to Sheriff Dalton. The charges against Jonas Creed are officially dismissed, and his name is cleared in the public record. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward to take the papers, his face grave. Jonas felt something loosen in his chest. Vindication, maybe, or just exhaustion at carrying the weight of false accusations for so long. Furthermore, Whitmore said, I'm transferring the deed to Jonas's original property back to him, along with significant financial compensation for his losses. But Jonas, he looked directly at Jonas again. I know money can't fix what I broke, so I'm proposing something else, something I hope might mean more. The room had gone completely silent. Jonas could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. I'm asking you to teach me, Whitmore said. Teach me what real wealth looks like, what community means, what it's like to build something with your hands instead of other people's labor. I want to spend time living as the workers on my railroad live. I want to understand what I've failed to see for 30 years. Jonas found himself walking forward before he'd made a conscious decision to do so. The crowd parted to let him through until he stood face to face with Whitmore. He could see the older man was afraid, not of physical harm, but of rejection, of having his offer refused. Why? Jonas asked quietly. Why now? Why this? Because in that barn, when we were cold and exhausted and stripped of everything but our basic humanity, I saw something I'd forgotten existed. I saw grace, undeserved, unearned grace. Whitmore's voice cracked slightly. You saved me when you had every right to let me die. That's been eating at me every moment since. I don't know if I can ever be worthy of that grace, but I want to try. Jonas thought about Mary, about the life they'd planned, about the dreams that had died with her. He thought about the 5 years he'd spent alone, hardening himself against the world. And he thought about what she would have wanted. Not vengeance, not even justice exactly, but the possibility of redemption. 1 month, Jonas said finally. You live like a worker for 1 month. Hard labor, simple food, no luxury. You do that, truly do it without complaint or special treatment, and I'll consider your apology sincere. Done, Whitmore said immediately. And one more thing, Jonas added. Whatever compensation you're offering, half of it goes to a fund for families affected by railroad expansion, families like mine who lost everything. You don't get to buy your way clear of this. Agreed. They stood there for a moment, 2 men who'd been enemies, now bound by something neither quite understood. Then Whitmore extended his hand. Jonas looked at it for a long moment before taking it. The handshake was firm, neither man backing down, but there was an understanding in it. This was a beginning, not an ending. The crowd erupted in conversation as Jonas turned and walked out of the hotel. He needed air, needed space to process what had just happened. Sarah caught up with him on the street, slightly breathless. Jonas, wait. That was... She stopped, searching for words. I can't believe he admitted it all. After all these years. Doesn't change what happened, Jonas said. No, but it changes what happens next. She touched his arm gently. You could have humiliated him in there. Could have refused his offer, made him look like a fool. But you didn't. What good would that have done? That's what I've always loved about you. Sarah said softly. "You've never confused justice with cruelty, even after everything." Jonas looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. She was older now, tiny lines around her eyes, but still beautiful in the way that came from strength of character rather than simple youth. "You made your choice years ago, Sarah. Can't fault you for it. You did what you had to do." "I know, but that doesn't mean it was the right choice. Just the safe one." She took a breath. "What I'm trying to say is, if there's ever a chance for me to make a different choice, I'd like to take it." Before Jonas could respond, they were interrupted by a group of townspeople wanting to talk to him, to apologize for their doubts, to thank him for his heroism. Jonas endured it as long as he could, then excused himself and made his way back to the livery to collect Dancer. But before he could leave town, old Ruth found him one more time. She pressed something into his hand, a beautiful quilt, folded carefully, the colors still vibrant despite its age. "This was Mary's," Ruth said. "She made it the winter before she died. Asked me to hold on to it for her. Said she wanted to give it to the community when the time was right. I think the time is right now. You give this to Whitmore when he starts his month of simple living. Remind him what real wealth looks like." Jonas unfolded a corner of the quilt and saw the intricate stitching, the care that had gone into every seam. This was hours and hours of Mary's time, her love woven into fabric. Tears pricked at his eyes, but he blinked them back. "She'd like that," he said hoarsely. "Using it to teach instead of keeping it locked away. That's what I thought." Ruth hugged him fiercely. "You're a good man, Jonas Creed. Don't you forget it." As Jonas rode Dancer back up the mountain trail that night, the quilt carefully packed, in his saddlebag alongside the wooden horses and the tarnished tin star, he felt the weight of the past few days settling over him. Everything had changed, and nothing had changed. Whitmore's confession had cleared his name, but it couldn't bring back Mary or the years they'd lost. The offer of compensation was generous, but money had never been what Jonas wanted. What he wanted, he realized as he reached his cabin and looked out over the darkened valley, was what he'd had before Whitmore had taken it away. A sense of purpose, of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. The question now was whether that could be rebuilt, or if some things, once broken, stayed broken forever. Whitmore began his month of humble living on a Monday morning. Jonas had arranged for him to stay in a worker's cabin near the mill, a single room with a cot, a stove, and little else. No servants, no fine meals, no comfort beyond what a laborer could afford on railroad wages. Jonas showed up at dawn to collect him, finding Whitmore already dressed in work clothes that looked stiff and new. The tycoon's hands were soft, uncalloused, and Jonas knew they'd be bleeding before the week was out. "We start with the basics," Jonas said. "Splitting wood, hauling water, maintaining your living space, then we'll move on to real work." The first day was brutal. Jonas set Whitmore to splitting logs for the mill, showing him the proper technique once before stepping back to watch. Whitmore attacked the work with determination, but no skill, his swings awkward, his aim poor. By noon, his hands were blistered and his shoulders were shaking with exhaustion. Jonas called a break and handed him a simple lunch, bread, cheese, and water. "This is what your workers eat," Jonas said, "every day, while you dine on steak and wine in hotel dining rooms." Whitmore ate without complaint, though Jonas could see the awareness dawning in his eyes, the understanding that this wasn't a single day's adventure but a month of relentless physical demand. As the days passed, Jonas watched Whitmore transform. The soft hands hardened, the pale skin tanned and toughened. The complaints Jonas had expected never came. Instead, Whitmore worked with grim determination, pushing through pain and exhaustion because pride wouldn't let him quit. On the 5th day, old Ruth assigned Whitmore to help in her store, sorting stock and serving customers. Jonas stayed nearby, watching as Whitmore met the families whose lives had been touched by his railroad, the widow whose husband had died in a construction accident, The farmer who'd lost his land to expansion, the children whose father still carried the scars of unsafe working conditions. One woman approached Whitmore directly, her face lined with years of hard living. "You're the railroad man, aren't you? The one who's learning to be humble." "I am," Whitmore said quietly. "My husband worked on your railroad for 3 years, fell from a trestle because you didn't want to spend money on safety equipment. Left me with 4 children and no income." She looked him straight in the eye. "What are you going to do about that?" Jonas stepped forward, but Whitmore waved him back. "I can't give you back your husband, Mom, but I can tell you that I'm changing the safety standards on all my railroads. And I'm establishing a fund for families like yours, families who've paid the price for my negligence. Money doesn't bring him back. No, it doesn't. And I'll carry the weight of that for the rest of my life." The woman studied him for a long moment, then nodded curtly and walked away. Jonas saw Whitmore's hands shaking as he returned to his work, saw the tears the man was fighting to keep back. That evening, Jonas brought Mary's quilt to Whitmore's cabin. The tycoon was sitting on his cot, his body clearly aching, his expression distant. "This was my wife's," Jonas said, handing him the quilt. "She made it the winter before she died, spent hours on it, every stitch done with care." Whitmore unfolded the quilt carefully, his rough hands catching on the delicate fabric. The pattern was simple but beautiful, stars and flowers interwoven in blues and golds. "It's remarkable," Whitmore whispered. "That's real wealth," Jonas said. "Time and care woven into something meant to be shared, not hoarded. Mary made this knowing she wouldn't be around to see it used. She made it anyway because that's what love does. It gives without counting the cost." Whitmore ran his fingers over the stitching, and Jonas saw something break in the man's face. He sat down heavily, the quilt clutched in his hands, and for the first time since Jonas had known him, Charles Whitmore wept. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere ancient and wounded. Jonas sat beside him and let him cry. There was nothing to say, nothing that would make this easier. Whitmore had to feel the full weight of what he'd done, had to sit with the grief of the lives he'd damaged and destroyed. Only then could he begin to change. When the tears finally stopped, Whitmore looked at Jonas with red-rimmed eyes. "I had a wife once," he said hoarsely. "Elizabeth. We were young when we married, full of dreams. I promised her I'd build something great, something that would last. But somewhere along the way, building the empire became more important than building a life with her." He wiped his face with the back of his hand. "She left me 15 years ago, took nothing but her clothes and a photograph of what we used to be. I told myself she was weak, that she didn't understand what I was trying to accomplish. But the truth is, I chose steel and money over flesh and love. And I've been alone ever since. Why did you keep going?" Jonas asked. "After she left, why keep building? Because stopping would have meant admitting I'd made the wrong choice. As long as I kept moving forward, kept acquiring more land and laying more track, I could tell myself it was all worth it." Whitmore laughed bitterly. "You know what I've discovered this past week? It wasn't worth it. Not any of it." They sat in silence for a while, the quilt spread across both their laps. Around Jonas's neck, beneath his shirt, hung Mary's wedding ring on its cord. He pulled it out now, letting it catch the lamplight. "I wear this to remember," Jonas said. "Not just Mary, but what matters. Love, connection, being part of something real." He looked at Whitmore. "Your grandfather's compass was supposed to guide you true. Maybe it's time you figured out what true north really is." Whitmore nodded slowly, his fingers still tracing the patterns in Mary's quilt. "Will you teach me? Really teach me, not just how to split wood or haul water, but how to be the kind of man who makes something like this. The kind of man who builds with love instead of ambition." "I can try," Jonas said. "But you've got to want it more than you've ever wanted anything. And you've got to be willing to keep wanting it even when it's hard, even when every instinct tells you to go back to what you know." "I want it," Whitmore said firmly. "God help me, I want it." The next 2 weeks were a revelation. Jonas introduced Whitmore to the rhythms of community life, the barn raisings where neighbors helped neighbors, the church suppers where food was shared freely, the quiet evenings where people gathered to talk and laugh without agenda or ambition. Whitmore learned to carve wood, sitting beside Jonas on the porch while children played nearby. His first attempts were clumsy, but he persisted, and gradually the shapes in the wood began to emerge. On the 23rd day of Whitmore's transformation, something happened that changed everything. Jonas had taken him to help repair the schoolhouse roof, working alongside Sarah and several other townspeople. They were taking a break, sitting in the shade with cool water, when a rider came thundering into town. The man was dusty and exhausted, his horse lathered with sweat. He dismounted in front of the hotel and immediately started asking for Charles Whitmore. Jonas felt a chill run through him. Nothing good came from messengers who rode that hard. Whitmore stood, brushing sawdust from his work clothes, and approached the rider. "I'm Whitmore." The man pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebag and thrust it at him. "Mr. Whitmore, I've been searching for you for 3 days. Your board of directors sent me. They've called an emergency meeting. The railroad investors are threatening to remove you from leadership if you don't return to San Francisco immediately." Whitmore opened the portfolio and scanned the documents inside. Jonas watched his face carefully, saw the flicker of the old Whitmore, the calculating, ambitious man who'd built an empire. Then something else crossed his features, something like resignation, or perhaps resolve. "Tell them I'll be there in 2 weeks. When my commitment here is finished," Whitmore said. "So with respect, they're not asking. The expansion into Oregon is stalling without your leadership. They're talking about selling controlling interest to Eastern investors who'll strip the company for parts. Everything you've built could be gone." Whitmore was quiet for a long moment. Jonas could see the war playing out inside him, the pull of the empire he'd spent 30 years building versus the new understanding he'd gained in these past 3 weeks. Finally, Whitmore looked at Jonas. "What would you do?" he asked. Jonas thought about it carefully. "I'd ask myself which loss I could live with. Losing the company or losing the man you've been trying to become. That's not a fair choice. Life rarely is." Whitmore turned back to the messenger. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 days. I need to finish something here first." When the messenger started to protest, Whitmore's voice took on a note of steel. 5 days, not negotiable. The messenger rode off, leaving an uncomfortable silence behind. The townspeople who'd been working on the roof had all stopped to watch, and Jonas could feel the tension in the air. Would Whitmore revert to his old ways now that his empire was threatened? Or would the transformation hold? That evening, Jonas found Whitmore in his cabin, surrounded by papers and documents that had been delivered with the portfolio. The man looked older somehow, the weight of difficult decisions evident in every line of his face. "I need to tell you something," Whitmore said without preamble. "Something I should have told you before, but I was ashamed." Jonas sat down, waiting. "When the railroad survey first came through this valley 5 years ago, I was on that survey team," Whitmore began. "I saw your ranch, saw you and Mary working together. You had what looked like a perfect life, simple, honest, happy, and I envied it. More than that, I resented it." He pulled something from the stack of papers, an old photograph, faded and creased. He handed it to Jonas. The image showed a younger Whitmore standing with survey equipment, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakable, were Jonas and Mary outside their ranch house. Mary laughing at something Jonas had said. "I took this photograph," Whitmore said. "Kept it all these years. Sometimes I'd look at it and tell myself that what you had was an illusion, that real success looked like what I was building. But the truth is, every time I looked at this photograph, I felt the weight of what I'd lost when Elizabeth left me." Jonas stared at the photograph, seeing himself and Mary as they'd been, young, in love, full of hope. The pain of it was almost physical. "When the survey determined that your land was the best location for the junction, I could have chosen a different route," Whitmore continued. "It would have cost more money and taken more time, but it was possible. Instead, I chose your land specifically because I wanted to destroy what you had. If I couldn't have that kind of happiness, why should you?" The confession hung in the air between them. Jonas set the photograph down carefully, his hands shaking slightly. This was worse than he'd thought. Not just a business decision, not just collateral damage in the name of progress, but deliberate cruelty, born of envy. "Why are you telling me this now?" Jonas asked, his voice tight. "Because you deserve to know the truth, all of it. And because I've been lying to myself, thinking that what happened to you was just a consequence of ambition. But it wasn't. It was malice." Whitmore's voice broke. "I destroyed your life because seeing your happiness reminded me of everything I'd thrown away. And I've been carrying that guilt like a stone around my neck ever since." Jonas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening valley. Behind him, he could hear Whitmore's ragged breathing, the man clearly expecting anger, possibly violence. Instead, Jonas felt something else, a terrible clarifying understanding. "The night in the barn," Jonas said slowly. "You said you didn't know if saving you made me a fool or a saint. I think I finally know the answer." He turned back to face Whitmore. "I'm neither. I'm just a man who chose not to let your sickness infect me. You were poisoned by envy and loss, and you tried to poison me with it by taking everything I had. But I'm still here, still capable of being decent, still capable of seeing another human being in distress and helping them. That's not sainthood, that's just refusing to let you turn me into what you were." Whitmore was weeping again, silently this time. "What do I do now? How do I live with what I've done?" Jonas thought about Mary, about the 5 years of isolation, about all the might-have-beens that would never be. Then he thought about the past 3 weeks, about watching this broken man try to rebuild himself into something better. "You live with it by making different choices going forward," Jonas said finally. "You go to San Francisco and you fight for your company, but you fight as the man you've been becoming, not the man you were. You use that empire to do right by people, instead of using people to build that empire. What if I can't? What if the pressure, the stakes, the old patterns are too strong? Then you'll fail. But you'll fail trying, which is better than not trying at all." Jonas picked up the photograph and looked at it one more time before handing it back to Whitmore. "Keep this, not as a trophy or a reminder of what you destroyed, but as a reminder of what matters. Every time you're tempted to choose empire over humanity, look at this and remember." The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity. Whitmore completed his month of humble living, though the circumstances were now changed by the looming crisis in San Francisco. He helped finish the schoolhouse roof, spent time with each of the families he'd wronged, and made concrete plans for the compensation fund he'd promised. On the final evening before his departure, Whitmore stood before the town once more, this time in the small church that served as the community's gathering place. His appearance had changed dramatically, the soft, pampered tycoon replaced by a lean, sun-weathered man with calloused hands and humbled eyes. "I came here a month ago with the intention of buying my way clear of my sins," Whitmore began. "I thought I could apologize, write some checks and move on. Jonas Creed taught me something different. He taught me that real wealth isn't measured in money or land or power. It's measured in the love we give, the connections we forge, the difference we make in other people's lives." He paused, pulling something from his pocket, the silver compass. "My grandfather gave me this and told me to let it guide me true. I lost my way for 30 years. Now I'm trying to find it again. Tomorrow, I return to San Francisco to fight for my company, but I'm fighting as a different man than the one who left. And if I fail, if they strip everything away, I'll come back here with empty pockets and full hands, ready to build something real." He looked directly at Jonas. "This man saved my life twice, once in the flood and once in the 3 weeks that followed. I owe him a debt I can never repay. But I can try to honor it by becoming the kind of man worth saving." The crowd was silent, moved by the raw honesty of his words. Then old Ruth began to clap and others joined in, not thunderous applause, but something quieter and more meaningful. Acceptance, perhaps, or at least the possibility of it. After the gathering dispersed, Jonas walked with Whitmore back to the hotel where he'd be staying his last night before the journey to San Francisco. At the door, Whitmore turned and extended his hand once more. "I don't know if I can hold on to what I've learned here," he said honestly. "The world I'm going back to, it doesn't reward humility or gentleness. It rewards strength and ruthlessness. Then be strong enough to be gentle," Jonas said. "Be ruthless in your kindness. That's the hardest kind of courage there is." They shook hands, and Jonas walked away into the night, leaving Whitmore to face whatever came next. As he passed the schoolhouse, he saw Sarah waiting on the steps. "Do you think he'll really change?" she asked. "I think he wants to. Whether he can is another question entirely. You gave him a chance. That's more than most would have done." Jonas sat down beside her on the steps, looking up at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. "Mary used to say that people deserve the chance to surprise you, to be better than you think they can be. I'm trying to live by that even when it's hard." Sarah took his hand, and they sat there in comfortable silence. Two people who'd found their way back to each other through flood and forgiveness and the complicated work of becoming who they were meant to be. 2 weeks passed, with no word from Whitmore. Jonas tried not to think about it too much, tried to focus on his own life and the changes happening in Ironwood Valley. The town was healing from the flood, buildings repaired, crops replanted, a sense of normalcy slowly returning. More importantly, Jonas felt himself healing too. The isolation that had protected him for 5 years was gradually giving way to connection. He'd started spending more time in town, helping where he was needed, accepting invitations to meals and gatherings. The wooden horses he carved were distributed to children throughout the valley, bringing joy in a way that felt like honoring Mary's memory rather than mourning it. And Sarah, she was there more and more often, conversations stretching into evenings, hands finding each other in quiet moments. The possibility of a future together becoming more real with each passing day. Then one morning, a telegram arrived at the general store, addressed to Jonas Creed. Old Ruth brought it to him personally, her face concerned. "Telegraph operator said it came from San Francisco," she said. "From Whitmore." Jonas opened it with shaking hands. The message was brief. "Coming back. Bringing trouble with me. Prepare town. 3 days." C.W. Jonas showed the telegram to Sheriff Dalton, who immediately called an emergency meeting of the town council. By that evening, word had spread through Ironwood Valley like wildfire. Whitmore was returning, and he was bringing trouble. "What kind of trouble?" asked Peterson, the livery stable owner. "Railroad men. Armed guards." "The telegram doesn't say," Jonas replied. "But Whitmore wouldn't warn us unless it was serious." Old Ruth spoke up from her seat near the back. "That man promised us he'd changed. He gave his word he'd use his power to help people instead of hurt them. Maybe we should trust that he meant it." "Trust is earned, not given," said another townsman. "Whitmore's proven what kind of man he is. A month of hard labor doesn't erase 30 years of cruelty." Jonas listened to the debate, torn between his natural caution and the hope that Whitmore's transformation was genuine. Finally he stood. "Whitmore saved my life once," Jonas said quietly. The room went silent. "I know that sounds backwards, given everything he took from me. But in that barn, during the flood, he could have stayed silent about what he'd done. He could have let me believe the comfortable lies. Instead, he told the truth, even knowing it would cost him. That takes a kind of courage most of us never have to find." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not saying we should trust him blindly. I'm saying we should prepare for the worst, while hoping for the best. Whatever's coming, we face it together as a community. That's what Ironwood Valley has always been about." The council agreed to establish watches at the edge of town to alert everyone when Whitmore and his trouble arrived. Jonas volunteered to coordinate the effort, working with Sheriff Dalton to ensure they'd have advance warning of whatever was coming. Those 3 days felt like the longest of Jonas's life. He spent them preparing, checking weapons, organizing townspeople into defensive positions if needed, making sure families with young children had plans to evacuate to the church on high ground. But he also found himself hoping, despite everything, that Whitmore would prove himself worthy of the grace Jonas had extended. Sarah found him on the second night, sitting on his porch, overlooking the valley. She brought coffee and sat beside him without speaking for a long while. "You're worried," she finally said. "I'm always worried. Comes with the territory of having lost everything once before, but you're also hopeful. I can see it in you, Jonas. You want to believe in him." Jonas sipped his coffee, considering. Mary used to talk about redemption. Not the religious kind exactly, though she had faith enough, but the kind where people get second chances to be better than they were. She believed in that so fiercely, even when people disappointed her. And you're trying to honor that belief. I'm trying. Some days it feels impossible. Most days, actually. But then I think about the alternative. Becoming so hard and cynical that I can't see the possibility of change in anyone. That's not living. That's just surviving. Sarah moved closer, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Whatever happens when Whitmore gets here, you've already shown this town what it means to have integrity. That matters, Jonas. That matters more than you know." On the morning of the third day, the watchers at the edge of town sent up the signal. A group of riders was approaching, at least a dozen, maybe more. Jonas and Sheriff Dalton rode out to meet them, bringing several armed townsmen as backup. What they found was both better and worse than expected. Whitmore led the group, but he looked nothing like the man who'd left 3 weeks ago. His clothes were torn and dusty, his face bruised, one arm bound in a makeshift sling. Behind him rode a mix of railroad workers and a few rough-looking men Jonas didn't recognize. And at the rear, bound and guarded, were 3 well-dressed men, who Jonas assumed were the railroad investors who'd tried to remove Whitmore from power. "Jonas!" Whitmore called out, his voice hoarse. "I need to speak with you, with the whole town. It's important." They brought the group into town, and within an hour the entire community had gathered in the street outside the church. Whitmore dismounted carefully, wincing with pain, and faced the crowd. "I went to San Francisco to fight for my company," he began without preamble. "The board of directors wanted to remove me because my new policies, better worker safety, fair compensation, profit sharing, were cutting into shareholder returns. They brought in Eastern investors who wanted to strip assets and run the railroad the old way. The way I used to run it," he paused, catching his breath. "I fought them, used every legal tool at my disposal, called in every favor I'd accumulated over 30 years in business. But they had more money and more ruthlessness, so I lost. They voted me out, took control of the company, and announced plans to expand the railroad through this valley using the old methods, seizing land, crushing opposition, treating workers like chattel." A murmur ran through the crowd. This was the nightmare they'd feared. Whitmore's empire turning on them without Whitmore himself to restrain it. "But here's what they didn't expect," Whitmore continued, and now his voice took on strength. "The workers refused to follow the new leadership. See, in the 3 weeks before I left San Francisco, I'd met with every crew, every foreman, every engineer. Told them about Ironwood Valley, about what I'd learned here. Told them they deserved better and promised I'd fight for them. When the board tried to implement the old policies, the workers went on strike." He gestured to the men behind him. "These are the strike leaders. They walked off the job and followed me here because they believe in what we're trying to build. A different kind of company, one that treats people like human beings. And these 3, he pointed to the bound investors, they followed us because they're not used to losing. They're planning to bring in hired guns, to break the strike with violence, and to make an example of this town." Jonas felt cold anger settling in his chest. "You brought them here? Led them right to us?" "I brought them here so you'd know they were coming," Whitmore corrected, "so we could face them together, instead of you being caught unaware. They were coming anyway. I just made sure I got here first." Sheriff Dalton stepped forward. "How many guns are they bringing? When will they arrive?" "Maybe 20 hired men. Could be here as soon as tomorrow, depending on how fast they can recruit in the mining camps." Whitmore looked directly at Jonas. "I know I'm asking a lot. I know you have every reason to turn your back on me and this fight. But these men," he gestured to the workers, "they believed me when I said things could be different. They gave up their livelihoods to stand up for what's right. I can't abandon them, and I won't let this valley suffer because of my choices." Old Ruth's voice rang out from the crowd. "So what's your plan, Mr. Whitmore? How do we face down 20 guns with a handful of farmers and shopkeepers? We don't face them alone, Whitmore said. I've sent telegrams to every newspaper in California, telling them what's happening here. I've contacted federal marshals, though they won't arrive in time. And I've offered these investors a choice: back down and accept the new worker protections, or have their reputations destroyed when the world learns they tried to massacre a peaceful town. One of the bound investors, a portly man with an expensive suit, now covered in trail dust, spat on the ground. You're finished, Whitmore. Even if you stop us, there'll be others. You can't change the way business works. Maybe not, Whitmore agreed. But I can try. And if I fail, at least I'll fail doing what's right instead of succeeding at what's wrong. Jonas looked at the crowd, saw the fear in their faces, but also the determination. These were people who'd already survived one disaster together. They could survive another. We need to decide, Jonas said to the town. Do we stand with Whitmore and his workers, knowing it might bring violence to our doorstep? Or do we turn them away and hope the investors leave us alone? The debate was brief but passionate. In the end, it was Sarah who spoke for many when she stood and faced the crowd. These investors see us as obstacles to profit. Whether we help Whitmore or not, they'll come for us eventually. The railroad will keep expanding, keep taking, keep crushing anyone who stands in the way. At least if we stand together now, we have a chance to show them that some things can't be bought or intimidated. A vote was called. By overwhelming margin, Ironwood Valley chose to stand with the workers and with Whitmore. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Jonas spent the rest of that day organizing defenses with Sheriff Dalton and the former deputies. They positioned men at strategic points around town, created fallback positions, and made sure families had plans for evacuation if things went badly. The railroad workers proved invaluable, many of them veterans of labor disputes, and they shared their knowledge of tactics the hired guns might use. As evening fell, Jonas found himself standing with Whitmore on the ridge above town, looking down at the lights beginning to flicker on in windows below. I'm sorry, Whitmore said quietly. I brought this to your doorstep. You brought yourself to our doorstep bleeding and asking for help, Jonas corrected. There's a difference. The trouble was coming anyway, from what you say. You just gave us warning. I keep thinking about that photograph. The one of you and Mary. You were so happy, so innocent of what was coming. And I destroyed it all, because I couldn't stand seeing what I'd lost, reflected in someone else's joy. Jonas pulled out his tin star, the one he'd worn as deputy all those years ago. In the fading light, it still looked tarnished and worn. Tomorrow, I'm going to pin this back on, not because I forgive everything or because we're friends now, but because someone has to stand between the innocent and the violence. That used to be who I was before you took it from me. Maybe it's time I took it back. Whitmore nodded slowly. If we survive tomorrow, I want to do something. I want to make sure that photograph, not the one of you and Mary, but what it represents. I want to make sure that happiness, that simple joy, that's what the railroad protects instead of destroys. I want to build something Mary would have been proud of. Then survive, Jonas said simply. Survive and keep that promise. That's the only redemption that matters. They stood there as full darkness fell over the valley. Two men bound together by flood and forgiveness, preparing to face the morning and whatever violence it might bring. Below them, Ironwood Valley settled in for an uneasy night, a community that had chosen courage over comfort, solidarity over safety. And somewhere in the darkness beyond, hired guns were riding closer, bringing with them a reckoning that would determine not just the fate of a railroad company, but the meaning of justice in a world that too often confused might with right. Dawn came cold and clear, the kind of morning that should have been beautiful, but instead felt heavy with anticipation. Jonas had spent most of the night checking defensive positions, making sure everyone knew their roles. Now, as the sun crested the eastern peaks, he stood in the middle of the main street with Sheriff Dalton, both of them wearing their badges, one tarnished and one polished, but both carrying the same weight of responsibility, The tin star felt strange on Jonas's chest after 5 years without it. Heavier than he remembered, or maybe he was just more aware of what it meant now. To wear this badge was to stand between the innocent and harm, to be willing to pay the price that came with protecting others. He'd forgotten that burden during his years on the mountain. Now it settled over him like a familiar coat, worn but still fitting. Whitmore stood nearby, unarmed as he'd promised, but his presence was important. The railroad workers were positioned around town, most of them with hunting rifles or old service revolvers. They weren't professional fighters, but they were determined. Old Ruth had organized the women to create a field hospital in the church, and Sarah was there now, preparing bandages and boiling water. The children had been evacuated to a cave system in the hills that only the locals knew about, guarded by the town's oldest men who were too frail to fight, but still clear-eyed enough to shoot. "They're coming," called out Peterson from his position at the edge of town. 20 riders, maybe more. Armed heavy. Jonas felt his heart rate slow, his breathing become measured. This was the calm that came before violence, the strange clarity that had kept him alive during his years as a deputy. He checked his rifle one last time, made sure his pistol was loose in its holster, and waited. The riders appeared like a dark stain on the horizon, coming on steady and confident. They rode in a loose formation, the kind that spoke of men who'd done this before, who expected intimidation to do most of the work for them. At their head was a man Jonas recognized from wanted posters, Marcus Kane, a notorious strikebreaker who'd left a trail of broken unions and dead workers across half the Western Territories. They stopped about 50 yards from where Jonas and Dalton stood. Kane nudged his horse forward a few more paces, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "This the town that's harboring stolen property?" Kane called out, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "This is Ironwood Valley," Jonas replied. "And the only thing we're harboring is our right to exist peacefully." "Turn around and there won't be trouble." Kane laughed, a sound without humor. "You wearing a badge, mountain man? Heard about you. Heard you spent 5 years hiding like a coward after your woman died. Now you want to play lawman again?" Jonas felt the words hit like physical blows, but he kept his face neutral. This was what men like Kane did. They probed for weakness, looking for the thing that would make their opponents angry and stupid. "I'm wearing the badge," Jonas said calmly. "And I'm telling you to turn around. We've got business here." 3 investors who were unlawfully detained, and a railroad company that needs to be reminded who owns it. "Hand over Whitmore and his troublemakers, and we'll be on our way." Whitmore stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Jonas despite the obvious danger. "These men aren't troublemakers. They're workers who deserve fair treatment and safe conditions. And I'm not going anywhere." "Your choice," Kane said. He looked past them at the town, clearly assessing their defensive positions. Jonas could see the calculation in his eyes. Kane was a professional, weighing the cost of violence against the certainty of victory. "But understand something. We're here on behalf of legitimate business interests. You're interfering with commerce, which makes you outlaws. When we're done, nobody's going to care what happened to a 2-bit frontier town that got in the way of progress." "That's where you're wrong," came a new voice. A man in a suit stepped out from behind one of the buildings, holding up a badge. "Federal Marshal James Thompson, and I care very much what happens here." Jonas felt surprise ripple through him. The marshal wasn't supposed to arrive for days. But here he was, with 3 deputies behind him, all of them armed and looking official. Kane's confidence flickered. "Marshal, this is a private business matter. Terrorism isn't a private matter," Thompson replied. "I've got sworn statements from workers describing systematic abuse, unsafe conditions, and threats of violence. I've got witnesses willing to testify that you were hired specifically to intimidate and harm civilians. So here's how this works. You and your men drop your weapons and submit to arrest, or you'll be adding assaulting a federal officer to your list of crimes." For a moment the morning hung in perfect balance. 20 hired guns against a handful of townspeople, railroad workers, and 4 federal officers. The smart play for Kane would be to back down, to accept that the fight had changed shape. But Jonas could see the anger in Kane's face, the pride that wouldn't let him admit defeat. "Your badges don't mean nothing out here," Kane said, his hand moving toward his gun. "Just more targets." The moment shattered. Kane drew, and the world exploded into violence. Jonas moved on instinct, his rifle coming up as he dove behind the water trough. Bullets whined through the air where he'd been standing a heartbeat before. He heard Dalton return fire, heard the crack of rifles from the defensive positions around town. The hired guns had expected intimidation to work, and now they were caught between trained lawmen and determined civilians. Jonas sighted on Kane, squeezed the trigger, and saw the strikebreaker's hat fly off. Kane dropped from his horse, scrambling for cover behind a wagon. The other hired guns were scattering, some returning fire, others clearly reconsidering their employment choices. "Hold your fire unless they shoot first," Marshal Thompson called out. "Give them the chance to surrender." But Kane wasn't surrendering. He was organizing his men, directing them to flanking positions. Jonas could see the tactical mind at work. Kane was a veteran, and he wasn't going to just run. He was going to make this cost something. A bullet splintered the water trough inches from Jonas's head, and he rolled to new cover, coming up behind a support post. He saw one of the hired guns drawing a bead on Whitmore, who stood frozen in the middle of the street, unarmed and exposed. Jonas didn't think. He broke from cover, running full out toward Whitmore. He hit the older man in a tackle that drove them both behind the relative safety of the general store's porch. A bullet carved a furrow in the planks where Whitmore had been standing. "Stay down," Jonas commanded. Then he was up and moving again, working his way toward where Kane had taken position. The fight had devolved into chaos. The railroad workers were giving better than they got, their defensive positions holding strong. The federal marshals were methodical and deadly, each shot carefully placed. And the townspeople fought with the desperation of people protecting their homes. Kane's men were professional, but they hadn't expected organized resistance. Jonas circled around behind the wagon, moving quiet as he'd learned during his years in the mountains. He could hear Kane directing fire, could see the man's back as he leaned out to shoot. Jonas could have taken the shot, could have ended it right there. But something in him rebelled at shooting a man in the back, even one like Kane. "Drop it," Jonas said, his rifle aimed at Kane's spine. Kane froze, then slowly raised his hands. "Smart move, lawman. You got me." Jonas should have known better. Should have remembered that men like Kane didn't surrender, they just waited for opportunities. Kane spun, his gun clearing leather with practiced speed, and Jonas had no choice. He fired. The bullet took Kane in the shoulder, spinning him around. Kane's gun discharged, the bullet going wild, and then he was down. Jonas kicked the weapon away and checked the wound. Serious, but not fatal, if they got him to the doctor quickly. With their leader down, the fight went out of the hired guns. Marshal Thompson's voice rang out again, offering surrender, and this time most of them took it. They'd been hired for an easy job of intimidation, not a pitched battle against federal law. Within minutes, 15 men had thrown down their weapons and were being bound by the deputies and railroad workers. 5 others had fled during the confusion, riding hard for parts unknown. Jonas let them go. They'd spread the word that Ironwood Valley fought back, that hired guns weren't welcome here. That message might save lives down the road. The aftermath was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes after violence. Jonas walked through the town, checking on people, making sure the wounded got to Sarah and the field hospital. Miraculously, no one from the town had been killed. 3 of the hired guns were dead, 6 others wounded, including Kane. The railroad workers had lost 1 man, a foreman named Jack, who'd taken a bullet protecting one of the younger workers. They'd bury him with honor. Jonas found Whitmore sitting on the church steps, his face pale, his hands shaking. The man who'd built an empire looked lost and small, confronted with the violence his business practices had created. "This is what I built," Whitmore said quietly as Jonas approached. "This is the legacy of my ambition. Good men dead because I couldn't be satisfied with enough. Because I had to have more, always more." Jonas sat beside him, his own hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "No, this is what you built before. What you build next, that's still up to you." From his pocket, Whitmore pulled the gold pocket watch, the one that had survived the flood but stopped working. He looked at it for a long moment, then handed it to Jonas. "I want you to have this," Whitmore said. "Not as payment or apology, because those things don't work anymore, but as a reminder. My grandfather told me that time well spent was the only real wealth. You taught me what that means. Maybe you can pass it on to someone else someday." Jonas took the watch, felt its weight in his hand. It was ruined, would never work again, but somehow that made it more valuable. A symbol of transformation, of time that couldn't be recovered, but could at least be honored. "I'll fix it," Jonas said. "And when I do, I'll remember this day. The day you stood with us, even though you had nothing to gain. The day you chose right over easy." Whitmore nodded, and for the first time since Jonas had known him, the man seemed at peace. Broken, yes. Humbled, certainly, but at peace. 6 months later, Jonas stood in almost the same spot where he'd first seen the flood coming. The valley had transformed again, but this time the change was one of healing rather than destruction. The spring rains had been gentle this year, bringing life instead of chaos. Fields were green with new crops. Buildings stood repaired and solid, and the town had an energy to it that spoke of confidence rather than fear. The railroad still ran through the valley, but it ran differently now. Whitmore had used the publicity from the confrontation to rebuild his company from the ground up. The workers owned shares now, had a voice in decisions, had safety equipment and fair wages. It wasn't perfect, nothing human ever was, but it was better. Measurably, significantly better. Jonas himself had changed too. He'd moved down from the mountain, built a small house on the edge of town where he could still see the peaks but be part of the community. He wore the deputy's badge most days, working with Sheriff Dalton to keep the peace. The work felt right in a way it hadn't before, because now he understood both sides, the need for law and the pain of injustice. And Sarah was there with him, had been there through all of it. They'd married in the fall, a quiet ceremony in the church with the whole town present. It wasn't the life he'd imagined with Mary, and he didn't try to make it that. It was something new, built on different foundations, and it was good. On this particular morning, Jonas was working on a project in his small workshop behind the house. The gold pocket watch lay disassembled on his workbench, its gears and springs spread out like the pieces of a puzzle. He'd been learning clockwork from a jeweler in the next town over, determined to honor his promise to Whitmore. The watch would work again, even if it took him years to figure out how. A knock at the door pulled him from his concentration. Whitmore stood there, looking healthier than Jonas had seen him in months. The railroad work was still demanding, but it no longer consumed him the way it once had. "Got something to show you," Whitmore said, a hint of excitement in his voice that made him seem younger. They walked together to the edge of town, where Jonas's old property lay. The land had been returned to him as promised, but Jonas had struggled with what to do with it. Too many ghosts lived there, too many memories of what had been lost. But as they crested the rise, Jonas saw that the land wasn't empty anymore. A building stood there, new construction, solid and beautiful. Not a house, but something larger. A school, Jonas realized. And beside it, a park with benches and trees, paths winding through gardens that were just beginning to bloom. "The Mary Creed Memorial School and Community Center," Whitmore said quietly. "The railroad funded it, but the town built it. We broke ground while you were up in the mountains last month checking trap lines." Wanted it to be a surprise. Jonas felt his throat tighten. He walked closer, saw the dedication plaque mounted beside the door. Mary's name, her dates, and below them, she believed in the goodness of people and the power of community. "This place stands as a testament to her faith." "There's more," Whitmore said, leading him inside. The main room was set up for teaching, with desks and a chalkboard and books lining the shelves. But in the back was a smaller room, and when Jonas entered it, he stopped in his tracks. Wooden toys filled the shelves, horses and dolls and wagons, hundreds of them. Some were the ones Jonas had carved over the years. Others were new, made by townspeople who'd learned the craft. Mary's trunk sat in the corner, now filled with toys meant to be played with, not locked away. Sarah suggested it, Whitmore said. A place where children can learn and play, where Mary's dream of a family, a community family, could come true. The toys are for any child who needs them. The school is free to all families, regardless of their ability to pay. And the community center will host gatherings, barn dances, church socials, whatever the town needs. Jonas picked up one of the wooden horses, his own work from years ago. A child's toy meant to bring joy. She would have loved this, he said hoarsely. This is exactly what she would have wanted. It's what you taught me to want, Whitmore replied. Real wealth, time well spent. Building something that lasts, not because it's made of steel, but because it's made with love. They stood there in comfortable silence. Two men who'd started as enemies and become something else. Not quite friends, perhaps, but brothers in a cause that mattered. The work of redemption, the work of building something better than what came before. Later that evening, Jonas sat on his porch with Sarah, watching the sunset paint the valley in golds and reds. The pocket watch was in his pocket now, still broken, but getting closer to whole. Old Ruth walked by with her grandson who was visiting from back east. The boy carried one of Jonas's wooden horses, playing out some adventure only children could imagine. You did good, Sarah said quietly, taking Jonas's hand. Mary would be proud of what you've built here. We built it, Jonas corrected. All of us. That's the point, I think. One person alone can't build anything that lasts. It takes a community. It takes people choosing each other, choosing to be better, choosing to believe in possibility even after everything falls apart. In the distance, a train whistle sounded, the evening run through the valley. It was a sound that once would have filled Jonas with bitterness, a reminder of everything he'd lost. Now it was just part of the valley's rhythm, neither good nor evil in itself, just a tool that could be used for building or destroying, depending on the hands that controlled it. Jonas touched Mary's ring where it still hung around his neck, then reached for Sarah's hand. The past wasn't forgotten, it never would be, but it no longer defined every moment of the present. The flood had taken everything, but in its wake, something new had grown. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something with its own value, its own meaning. As darkness settled over Ironwood Valley, lights began to flicker on in windows. Families gathering for evening meals, children being called in from play. The community that had chosen courage over fear, that had stood together against violence, that had believed in the possibility of redemption. They were writing a new story now. And Jonas Creed, the mountain man who'd saved his enemy and in doing so saved himself, was part of that story. Some choices define us more than a lifetime of words ever could, and sometimes the hardest choice leads us home.